Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have ICE claims that immigrant shattered his skull running into wall from CP24.com, posted by Tom13. And yeah, personally, I don't know if that's why the immigrant shattered his skull. I think it'd be more likely that ICE beat him up rather than him just running into a wall. But ultimately, ICE can say whatever they want to, and if people want to believe them or not, that's on them. That's very much how things work these days. People say stuff, and then it just depends whether you want to believe them or not. It's very much how social media works. People only want to believe what they want to believe. I'm sure if this was if ICE was out group code was in group coded rather than out group coded, Reddit would completely believe whatever they claimed. But of course, since ICE is out group coded, Reddit of course isn't gonna fall for it because they don't really believe anything ICE says unless it suits their narrative. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have protesters have completely trashed Los Angeles ICE facility using a large dumpster to barricade the exit, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross post of the World Viewer from the World Viewer subreddit. And it looks like a video of just exactly that. Protesters trashing the Los Angeles ICE facility using a large dumpster to barricade the exit. And yeah, personally, if these protesters were out group rather than or in group rather than or no out group rather than in group, yeah, since they're in group currently for Reddit, Reddit will think this is the worst thing ever. This is what Reddit thinks is like January 6th is. It's violent. It's they're going against the government building and invading it, but since it's the out group, since the in group's doing it, it's completely justified. And yeah, it's interesting. If these people were MAGA, Reddit would think this is the worst thing ever. But since these people are more woke adjacent, Reddit thinks this is the greatest thing ever. It's interesting. Reddit's like, oh, I hate violence, but then they'll always justify any violence that their side commits. Or they'll try and say like in the case of like the guy who shot Charlie Kirk, they say, oh, he's actually a right winger. It's just it's interesting how Reddit always manages to bend everything to fit its agenda. If people want to protest against ICE, I think they should be able to. But I know if the shoe was only every foot, and these were out group coded protesters rather than in group coded protesters, and they were going up against a group that Reddit supported rather than opposed, Reddit would think this is the worst thing ever. It doesn't really matter what people do. It matters who does what, I would say. It's like the George Floyd riots and the January 6th riots. If the people who did them were reversed, like 80 to 90% of the people opinion on them would change. A lot of people who think the George Floyd riots were the worst thing ever and January 6th was no big deal, they'd suddenly reverse their positions on both of those. And it's the same for people who think the George Floyd riots were no big deal and that January 6th was the worst thing ever. It's just who's in the in group, who's in the out group, rather than what's actually happening. Next we have, I was once called a conspiracy theorist for noticing patterns. What has changed is not my beliefs, but the world's willingness to acknowledge what is happening in front of it. The danger now is not paranoia, but complacency. From Medium.com, posted by The Chaotic Mage, and that's linked from a Medium, The Rise of Authoritarianism. And yeah, personally, I think, and it looks like they posted it twice actually, but regardless, if people do want to call you a conspiracy theorist, I think that's fine. But ultimately, a conspiracy theorist is just a term it's gonna be thrown around to discredit any and all dissent whatsoever. And ultimately, if the past decade hasn't taught you anything, I would say that it's most what a lot of the elite marketed as conspiracy theories are oftentimes end up being true. It's like, they said, oh, Pizzagate is a conspiracy theory, and now look, you have all the Epstein Island stuff, and a lot of people will say, oh, Pizzagate, there was no basement at the pizza store they thought all the sex trafficking was happening at, that Comet Ping Pong, but, maybe that was code too, they were already talking in code, the pizza was code for children, maybe the basement was code for Little St. James, aka Epstein Island. Ultimately, I would say that if you're not a conspiracy theorist by this point, you trust too much in the institutions. Personally, I would say the libertarian perspective is you got to be kind of a conspiracy theorist. You got to always question what the elites are doing, and what not what they say in the public, but what they do in the shadows too. And oftentimes, I would say we don't even know who's really running the show. People like Donald Trump or any other elected representative. That they're oftentimes the fall guys. I would say for who's really running the show, which is the deep state. Agencies like FBI, CIA, NSA, and the special interests like the military-industrial complex, big tech, big pharma, big media, etc., etc. They're the ones really running the show, and oftentimes I would say the people who are really running the show are doing so from the shadows rather than where you can openly see them, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have 2026 World Cup. Fan group extremely concerned by ICE raids in U.S. for summer tournament from BBC.com, posted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, I think the World Cup's going to go off without a hitch, despite Reddit thinking it's going to fail miserably. If it's going to fail miserably, it's going to be because the ticket prices are too damn high. I was looking at the ticket prices yesterday on the FIFA's website. The lowest ones start from $1,400, then you go up to almost $3,000, and these are just the group stage games. And yeah, personally, Reddit will say the U.S. should be the World Cup should be taken away from the U.S. because it's an authoritarian regime, and you shouldn't be rewarding authoritarian regimes with soccer tournaments. But of course, FIFA doesn't really care. FIFA awarded the past two the past two World Cups in Russia and Qatar, which are even more authoritarian than the Trump era U.S. Despite how Reddit would probably argue otherwise. But ultimately. I think the tournament's probably gonna go off without a hitch, especially despite how this user and a lot of other writers think it's gonna go completely fail. But I guess we'll have to wait and see on that front. Next we have I'm Beginning the Revolution, looking for like-minded people, posted by Eagle Apprehensive. And they said, become an Atlas Society citizen. I will need a lot of help to make that happen. Immutable, decentralized P2P network and shared database, cryptographic signatures, trust reputation contribution points, and digital documents, quadratic voting mandates. Every day, every verified citizen gets one vote mandate, capping at 100, decided on digital documents passing, personal, decentralized content management system, eventual interoperability of your data, and they link to, I guess, a screenshot of it, and then a GitHub link of it, and then they say, TLDR, I'm building an app that'll start the decentralization process of internet. I'm looking for like-minded crazy people who have time and energy to try changing the world. Have a good day. And yeah, personally, if they want to do that, I think they should be able to. When I first saw this post headline, I thought it was a lot of people on the subreddit are woke Marxists, so I thought it would be like woke Marxists call for revolution. But it seems to be one of the tech bros plugging their app, and ultimately, I think if they want to plug their app, I think that's fine. But ultimately, and I do think the decentralization process of the internet is important. But there already are enough, I would say, social networks out there. You have Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, X, or I guess Twitter. Well, I guess it's X now, but simply we'll still call it Twitter. And you have Blue Sky, which is all where the woke Redditors go. You have Discord, you have Signal, we have countless social networks already. I don't know why we need another one. But if they want to make their own, I think that they should be able to. And hopefully it can take off. But I personally think the field's already kind of crowded at this point. But yeah, I'm just glad that it wasn't a woke Marxist call for revolution. It seems more like a tech bro just shilling his app. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have CNN. Trump promises Amtrak funnel funding if redesigned Penn Station is named after him, from CNN.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the Amtrak subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think this is just another Orange Man Bad headline. I don't think Penn Station is going to be named after Donald Trump. Maybe if he gets assassinated, which I'm sure Reddit would love, but I don't think it's too likely, considering the people who are most likely to assassinate him are too busy jerking themselves off on Reddit to actually do anything IRL. But regardless, I this is very much distraction. Trump's very good at when it comes to distractions. The U.S.'s big things this year has been the regime change in Venezuela and the attempted regime change in Iran. Yet, he distracts people with stuff like Greenland or putting his name on the Kennedy Center or all the presidential plaques at in the White House Rose Garden or East Garden or wherever they are. And it's very much Trump is very. It's why Trump I think is very smart. He's very good at all these distractions. It's very much, if Trump's doing something that sounds like it's WWE megalomaniacal heel shit like this, I think it's very much one of those distractions. But of course, Reddit and the legacy media like CNN are going to take the bait every single time. Next we have, imagine if it was the ATF going into homes, make sure your weapons are quote-unquote compliant, posted by FastlyRubenus739, and that's a cross post from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. And yeah, personally, and that looks like a clip of Mike Johnson, I guess, saying that or something, I don't know, about ICE or... Yeah, but it just goes to show you that, if you're justifying ICE as authoritarianism now, it can be used against you later. ICE is just one government agency. And if you do agree that, illegal immigrants should be deported, and I think in a lot of instances they should, especially if they're violent criminals, just because they need to be deported doesn't mean that all their government authoritarianism is going to be justified in doing so. I think in the ideal world, ICE would be a private militia rather than a public government agency, and ultimately only deport violent criminals instead of everyone who's here illegally. But ultimately, the government can justify doing whatever it feels like, and if it can do it with ICE, it can do it with pretty much any agency, and that includes the ATF. So ultimately, this if you're praising the government's actions now when it comes to ICE, you don't be surprised if they use it against you later. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, even if we lose, it was worth it, posted by LongNoodle93, and that's crosspost from the Thomas Massey subreddit, and that's a meme. Your bruise mean nothing to me. It's a picture of Thomas Massey. I've seen what makes you cheer. And I'd agree with that. Thomas Massey's probably one of the few good politicians in D.C. He's actually trying to expose all the Epstein stuff, and I personally I don't really vote for uniparty candidates, but if he's on the ballot for president in the near future, I might have to make an exception for him. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And then there was a post I wanted to share from the LPUS subreddit. I originally posted it to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit, but got removed, censored. I complained, but as I said in the last episode, they let 95% of my shit stay up, so, the bar for Reddit censorship's below the ground at this point, so, at this point, you just have to take what you can get. And I said, building your brand is libertarian. I said, when it comes to the attention economy of social media, it's more to develop as big a following as possible. It's why I try to be active on as many platforms as realistic as possible and try to engage with others as regularly as possible. It's also why I don't use AI for much anything. My thoughts be as authentic as possible and really could be coming from me. Of course, no one is entitled to attention, just like how no one is entitled to anything else. Well, that being said, what do you guys recommend to grow your brand as libertarian influencers, so to say? As I stated, I try to put myself out there as much as possible, even if I don't get the most engagement out of it. I'm planning something that I don't think is going to pan out, but if it does, I think it would really help grow my brand. Thoughts. And yeah, personally, I definitely do think, it can be hard to grow your brand on social media. People only want to hear what they want to hear. They don't want principled takes. They want just to hear circle jerk whatever their current opinion are. It's like look at the front page, right? It's just Republicans bad constantly. And yeah, I personally don't really care for Republicans, but Reddit only cares that Republicans are bad. They don't really care that Democrats are bad. Maybe occasionally you'll have a picture of Bill Clinton in relation to the Epstein stuff, or they were critical that Kamala relaunched her HQ on Twitter and named it Headquarters 67, which I think is very cringe. It's like modern Pokemon Go to the polls. But regardless, Reddit and a lot of people only go after authoritarians when they're the wrong color. I would say the principled libertarian position would be go after all authoritarians, regardless of which branch of the Uniparty they serve. And I think that's where it's not going to be popular when you constantly both sides of everything, I would say. But yeah, that's my thoughts there, and I'll share with you guys the thing if that I think will help grow my brand if it does pan out. But until then, I'm gonna keep it under wraps and keep it a surprise. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the wait, no, we have a new post. Sorry, Europeans may not be flocking to the World Cup this summer. New data suggests from Forbes.com, posted by The Way to Beauty. And as I said, ultimately, I think the World Cup will be successful. Maybe the Europeans won't come, but you definitely will. I definitely still think FIFA's gonna make a profit at a minimum, just like they usually do. So I think we're gonna wrap up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.